I think a place that helps to teach that powerful virtue of meekness, of being self-controlled, or not just simply self-controlled, but allowing our conscience to be formed by something greater than ourselves and what is immediately in front of us, is St. Mary's Church in St. Mary's, Pennsylvania. A little bit of history is in order, because the history of St. Mary's, which is one of the most Catholic places in the United States, is a rich and fascinating history. When Catholics came to the United States in the 1840s and 1850s, they were oftentimes discriminated against. There was a movement that was very powerful, especially in cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore, called the Know Nothing movement, or the Nativist movement. There was an idea that Catholics could not really be part of Christian America. They're not real Christians. The German Catholic Brotherhood of Baltimore, which also had a branch in Philadelphia, met in early 1842, and they decided that they would look for a piece of property where they could live out their faith and they could practice the traditions of their ancestors. And they settled on this piece of property in modern-day Elk County. Now, in what would become St. Mary's, this region was a vast forest. Hemlock trees grew so thick, virgin forests that were so ancient you could hardly even see the sunlight. There that group set out and they purchased 35,000 acres in what would become St. Mary's. The German Catholics came out of Baltimore and Philadelphia, and they settled initially just south of here, around the town of Kersey. And there they had rudimentary dwellings on what was called the Green Farm. And the men would leave that and walk that settlement and walk to what would become St. Mary's. And they would walk on paths carrying things, because there really weren't roads that went into this vast wilderness. While they were here, they built very small cabins. And on December the 8th, 1842, they left that settlement, the Green Farm near Kersey, and they brought their families to this howling wilderness to practice their faith in freedom. And it was on that day, December the 8th, the feast day of the Immaculate Conception, that Mass was celebrated here with the families present. The city that evening was named Marienstadt. In time it would be known as St. Mary's, a name in honor of our Blessed Lady. St. Mary's would be a place that was imbued with faith. Initially, the first settlers were here and were able to practice their faith, and they were ministered to by Redemptorist priests from Baltimore. They would write about the lifestyle here and say it was, even though it was simple, it was a little share in Catholic Germany. In time, the Redemptorist priests were unable to stay, and the Benedictine order came here from Latrobe, and they remain here at St. Mary's to this very day. To aid them in their journey, the priests helped look out for them, and they wrote to King Ludwig I of Bavaria, and through the Missionsverein, or the Mission Society, funds were sent from the King of Bavaria right here to St. Mary's, so that people could be able to live a life where they were able to build a life here and be able to practice their faith. Eventually, more settlers continued to come here from Germany. This church was built in 1852, and it was built by the people themselves. Initially, they had prayed in a log church, which is depicted in one of the windows in the old convent chapel. But in 1852, the people dug the foundation for this church. They felled large hemlocks, which went to support the church. Stones were dumped off here, and families and men, after their hard work here, would dress all of the stones, and they built this church. It was on December the 8th of 1852 that this church, unfinished, was used for the first time, and eventually this church was a consecrated church. So it has a particular level of solemnity. The magnificent high altar inside of St. Mary's Church was carved by a Benedictine lay brother by the name of Brother Cosmas Wolf, who had been trained at the Academy of Arts in Munich. It's a magnificent altar that stands on its own foundation, for this is a consecrated church. Now, on the high altar, you have a number of different images. You have St. Boniface, who is the patron saint of the Germans. You have St. Patrick, interestingly enough, patron saint of the Irish. You have a number of the doctors of the church, and you have an image of the Immaculate Conception of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Now, in that painting, you'll see a young priest who is off to the right, and he actually is dressed, it looks like, as a deacon in the particular painting, and that's St. John Henry Neumann, or Newman, the fourth Bishop of Philadelphia, who, as a Redemptorist priest, actually visited St. Mary's, and his name is in the baptismal record here. Now, within the altar, there are relics, as there are in Catholic altars, a reminder of the early days of the Church when people prayed at the catacombs, those underground cemeteries where the early martyrs were often interred. And the relics here are known. Which saints' bone fragments are embedded in this altar? Among them are St. Martin of Tours. However, there are two saints that deserve particular attention because they're relatively obscure. The one is a nun, and her name was St. Hyacinth Maghsoudi. Now, St. Hyacinth Maghsoudi was born into a fairly well-to-do family. However, she intended to marry, but her suitor rejected her for her younger sister. She entered the convent and, probably with some lackluster motivation, entered the convent to simply escape that bad situation. When she first entered the convent, her life was lived with a sense of complacency. Her conscience was affected through the actions of a priest who called her out and called her back to her senses. At the end of her life, she served those that were poor. In fact, people that were too ashamed to beg, she would go and get alms for them. She looked after prisoners. She died a very, very holy death. Her relics are here. It's a reminder that as much as we have things that pull us in one direction or the other, our faith remains stable and consistent. One of the other saints whose relics may be in here is St. Andrew Wouters. Father Andrew was not a very good priest. He really was a very poor example of priesthood. When the people arrested him, the idea was he will be the prize. Look at this disgrace. Look at this weak man. Look at this person who's marked with all of his sins. We're going to make a mockery out of him, and we will, in so doing, defame the Catholic faith. What did Father Andrew do? He said, in spite of all of my personal weaknesses, and he had many, I will never deny the true presence of Christ in the Eucharist. I might be a very weak person who made some very poor decisions in life, and maybe always wasn't the finest priest, but I will never water down my faith. You know, a lot of people would have probably just gone along, as many people did when anti-Catholic forces rode in hundreds of years ago. But he wouldn't give up the faith of his fathers, and for that sort of lackluster priest died a heroic death of a martyr, and he's a canonized saint. Maybe whether it is St. Hyacinth or St. Andrew Wouters or whomever, these relics embedded in this altar remind us that while the world turns, the altar stands steady. As long as we hold on to that, being me is an opportunity for us to allow our heart and our mind, our ethics, our freedom, our will, to be formed by something bigger than what's immediately in front of us.